Good morning and welcome to the March 2025 edition of Mills and Reeves Cover Talk. My name is Helen Tilley and I joined the insurance team in early September, and this is the first Cover Talk webinar that I'm presenting. And I decided to concentrate on a small number of misconceptions which arise in relation to accidental health insurance. So let's turn first to the concept of accident health. Sometimes it's referred to as personal accident, sometimes as PA, but effectively it's the same thing. And the objectives today are to provide a brief overview, and I do have a back to basics, much longer session going through things in more detail, which can be made available to your in-house team. The main focus about the misconceptions is to try to make things clearer at the sales stage and also to avoid disputed claims. And I'll be covering some of the phrases that appear in this type of insurance, such as accidental bodily injury and solely and independently of any other cause. And in the process, making some distinctions between personal injury claims and life cover. And then finally, I'll be wrapping up with some comments about misunderstandings about who actually receives the money, who receives the benefit. So let's set the scene. So here I've included a traditional worded insuring clause, which would crop up in an A&H policy. So if the person suffers accidental bodily injury during the period of cover, which within 2 years, solely and independently of any other cause, results in death, permanent disablement, and in this particular example, the options were wider, so there were specific payments for things like burns, fractures, hospitalisation. But some cover does include more modern style wording where the bodily injury would be caused only by an accident and on its own lead to disablement or death. Broadly the same thing. So turning to the actual types of payment. So you'll see on this slide, the black lettering, that effectively is the core type of cover that you would have under this policy. So most of you probably at some point have had your own travel policy, and travel insurance will include in one of its sections an A&H benefit, and this will most likely include these lump sum payments for various permanent disablements or accidental death. In a more sophisticated policy, so for instance, if your employer takes out travel insurance with personal accident, it's likely that there will be a longer list of different benefits that could be available to you, including other types of permanent disablement, such as paraplegia, and what's called the continental scale. So this will be setting out various percentages for a broad list of different types of permanent disability, right down to maybe 2% of the sum assured if you lost your little finger. Another option which is possible is to provide a monthly benefit up to a period of 2 years for temporary total disablement, which will be linked to ability to work. So these are useful. These policies are useful in terms of providing comfort if there is a career-ending injury. They're also useful because they can be bespoke benefits can be made available. So, for instance, if you're a bank worker, it might be attractive for there to be occupational assault additional benefits. If you're a nurse, needle stick injuries might be an attractive option as well. Turning to the express exclusions, the number of exclusions that you would find in an A&H policy is broadly much longer than you would see in a life policy. I've given a standard example, which would be misuse of drugs and alcohol here. But again, the policy can be bespoke to the particular requirements of the policyholder. And for instance, if you were a commercial ship engineering company, You may be happy to have cover where the person is travelling by road or train to the port, and whilst they're carrying out work activities inside the boat, but not whilst you're transferring and working across water, as that would be potentially either increase premiums a lot, or it might not be attractive to the insurer to provide cover in relation to that. So turning to the next slide, and this absolutely essential element of this type of cover is understanding the concept of accident. In the majority of cases, there will be an express definition for accident. Sometimes it might be linked together with the definition for bodily injury, so that you will have a composite definition for accidental bodily injury. In the very, very rare cases where there is no definition, then the case law, Fenton and Thorley, indicates that effectively what you're looking at is an unlooked for mishap, something not expected or designed. And again, there'll be straightforward cases. If somebody has a car accident, it's obvious that that is an accident. The collision is the cause and method of the injury. But there are also more subtle scenarios where maybe somebody is going about an everyday activity. It's something that they're deliberately doing, but what the accidental element is the outcome, the result. And one example of that in the case law is where somebody literally is dropping down to pick up a marble from the floor and they injured their knee. So they weren't expecting that type of injury. So turning to the next slide, if we look at misconceptions, and these are things that I've sort of noticed over working in this area for about 30 years. Quite often, if somebody has an insurance policy claim under an accidental health policy, whether it's their own individual policy or a group policy, and if they've got a personal injury claim going at the same time, they assume that the scenario will lead to a payout in both occasions. With A&H cover, it's broader in the sense that you don't need to have, nobody needs to be at fault. You don't need to have a situation where somebody owes you a duty of care. However, the insured person, although they could be acting unwisely, there is a sense check in that if they go so far that they are regarded as courting a risk, which again is a phrase commonly used in A&H cover, then that would not be payable. You could find that the cover is 24-hour worldwide cover. However, sometimes there are restrictions. So sometimes with a group policy, it might state that the injury needs to happen whilst they're carrying out work activities. With a travel policy, different categories of employee could be insured for different types of insured journey. It might be restricted to business travel, or it may be possible to tag on a holiday at the end of a business travel and for the injury to happen during the holiday. But broadly, with 24-hour worldwide cover, you could simply be enjoying yourself on a bank holiday doing some DIY, and the injury happens at that point. So an underlying principle is that accident and health insurance cover is not intended to respond to the effects of disease or illness. And the reason for that is that a disease or illness would be regarded as a natural result of a natural cause. But a key difference with personal injury claims is that with A&H, you don't take the claimant as you find them. So in other words, the eggshell skull rule, which applies in personal injury cases, does not apply in A&H cover. So I've mentioned here the Scott and New Creek case. This is an example of a case in which the claimant did have a valid personal injury claim, an EL claim. However, there was no payment due under the A&H policy. And the reason for that is that when they looked at the medical evidence, they established that he had this degenerative disc disease. What happened on the actual day of the work injury was that it was a muscular injury, and the disc prolapse actually happened 6 weeks later. So this meant there was a small amount of a claim under the EL policy, but he didn't actually have a valid claim under the A&H policy. So turning to the next slide, I mentioned earlier on when I was looking at the insuring clause that A&H cover has this unusual phrase, solely and independently of any other cause. And the reasoning behind that is what we're trying to do when we're looking at a claim is we're trying to establish what was caused solely by the accident. So that involves looking at the mechanics of the incident, what type of forces were involved. And then both the claims assessor and invariably the medical experts need to try to look at the case in a particular way and ask themselves, let's imagine that the person didn't have a particular pre-existing medical condition. And let's look at what the mechanics of that incident involved. What would that type of incident on its own have caused? And then the converse way to look at it is to imagine, let's imagine that the incident didn't happen at all. We know somebody's got a pre-existing condition. What would happen? What would be expected? Would there be an increase in symptoms? What sort of type? What sort of severity? And for how long? And at what point could that potentially occur? So that's the thought process that's involved. Now, today's session, with it being a cover talk, bite-size piece, there isn't enough time to go through the extent of case law which we look at in relation to causation. So I've included just a few cases on the next slide. Jason against Batten, if you're dealing with cases where there is more than one cause, that includes a very useful 3-point test to help you think through the facts of that case and decide whether you believe that the incident was the sole cause. If you've got a situation where somebody had a previous medical condition, but it's dormant and there's no symptoms at all, Fidelity against Mitchell is the key case there. And from a football perspective, the Blackburn Rovers had a series of cases in the early 2000s relating to disc prolapse and disc degeneration. And effectively, what the court said during the course of that case was that it was fine for insurers to decide that they would not be willing to pay out in relation to normal degeneration, and it was acceptable in order to effectively exclude the effects of a pre-existing condition. The outcome in that case was that there was no payment because they decided that the degenerative disc disease was a cause of Martin Darlin's ongoing disablement. The other case I wanted to mention is a more recent case from the 2nd of August. It's an Australian case, but it's helpful to look at Commonwealth cases as well. And we also sometimes look at US cases in order to consider how the court has approached it. In that case, no payment was made because Ethan Lowe did not satisfy the definition for permanent hemiplegia, but there were some obiter passing comments in relation to the meaning of solely and independently of other cause, which I query are entirely well considered. The second misconception that crops up is in scenarios where there is a pre-existing medical condition, but the insured person had no idea, so it was completely unknown to them. Now, I've try to illustrate this with this particular case study, which involved a professional footballer. He had 24-hour worldwide cover. However, it wouldn't respond if he was injured whilst playing or training. So outside playing and training, unfortunately, he suffered a cardiac arrest because of arrhythmia. Or despite the fact that there were doctors close at hand and they tried their best with treatment, unfortunately, he died. And during the post-mortem, they established that there was an indication of ventricular fibrillation. And I also noticed that his heart was about twice the size of average. The rationale behind deciding that it was not appropriate for the accident and health policy to respond to pay out for accidental death was because of the underlying illness. And it was supported that the Jason against Batten case is authority for the fact that it's irrelevant if a pre-existing illness is not known at all and effectively is a surprise. So turning to misconception 3, quite often when I see claims, the claimants will concentrate on the definitions for the benefits. So they'll look at the permanent total disablement definition, or if it's a specific condition, they'll look at, say, hemiplegia. And they tend to skip over and not appreciate the relevancy of the insuring clause, which I mentioned at the outset. So that effectively is the first consideration, and this was reinforced by the courts in the Blackburn Rovers and Avon case that I mentioned in the previous slide. It is correct that it is much clearer for there to be an express exclusion, but it isn't absolutely essential. I suppose one of the benefits of having an exclusion is if you have two causes of roughly the same potential relevancy, the Wayne tank principles apply. And if there's an express exclusion, that would be another reason for saying that the policy doesn't respond in that case. I mentioned earlier on the concept of courting of risk. This wouldn't be expressly mentioned in the policy. It's a general principle that applies. And as an illustration of this, I looked at a sailing fatality in which the person had had a head injury. But the reason why they had a head injury was because they hadn't clicked on, they hadn't followed the procedures. So despite having the health and safety training and being given warning reminders and the weather being really, really awful, they hadn't clicked on. And that ultimately, having looked at the accident reports and the statements, was the reason for this unfortunate incident. And the test to apply when looking at courting of risk is whether there has been reckless conduct and what was the natural and probable consequence of their actions. And the final point that I wanted to raise in terms of misconceptions is where there are misunderstandings about who should receive the benefit. And this quite often arises if a couple take out cover, perhaps even they've paid the premium from a joint bank account. So understandably, if one of those couples dies, the survivor invariably will think that the accidental death benefit will be paid directly to them. But that is not the case. So with accident and health cover, when you're dealing with accidental death benefit, the payment goes into the deceased's estate. And that means that the insurer needs to be communicating with the personal representatives. Where there's sometimes difficulties is that there could also be a group death in service cover for that particular person, and those generally will pay out quicker because the cover is set up with a trust deed, and the insurer can therefore make the payment to the trustees. And it's then for the trustees to look at any expression of wishes from that person which they made during their lifetime, and then exercise their discretion as trustees as to where the money is then paid out to. And the reasoning behind that is because there are tax favourable treatments for group death in service cover, which means that the money doesn't go into your estate. So the moral is it's much better to have a will. So to sum up, the takeaways today are to make it clear in your literature that any accidental death benefit would be payable to the estate. And in terms of the benefits of the accidental health cover, I've tried to explain why the personal, it's much broader in risk to personal injury risk. It's also much more cost effective than life cover. But an underlying point is that the risk covered is more contained because of this essential element of there needing to be an accident. And when you're looking at the effects of illness, illness wouldn't be covered because it would be regarded as a natural result of a natural cause. But as a closing point, the real selling point, I think, for this type of cover is that it has various bespoke options. So it's excellent for those who might be travelling to hotspot areas such as journalists and charity workers. You could provide extra cover for those sectors where there is a greater risk of occupational assault, such as in banking, head teachers in education. And for instance, with the marine sector and high risk jobs, you can provide bespoke cover as well. If somebody's a manual worker or perhaps working in healthcare where they could have sort of injuries whilst moving people, then to have the option of an additional benefit for retraining, maybe £25,000, would definitely make the cover more attractive as well. And with group cover, payments can also be made and kept sometimes by the policyholder, for instance, to cover the additional cost of recruiting another person temporarily or full time. So I hope that that's been helpful. If you want to raise questions, there's the option to put questions into the Q&A, and Harriet is alongside and able to sort of moderate any questions or issues that could crop up.
Thank you very much, Helen. There's just one or two which we have time for. The question one comes to us like this. You mentioned that you didn't think that the Lowe case was entirely well considered. Are you able to explain why you have that thought?
Well, I think they probably went a little bit too far. Ultimately, there was no payment because Ethan Lowe couldn't satisfy the definition for permanent hemiplegia. But they did make sort of passing comments about the meaning of solely and independently. And he had this particular injury in July 2020, but he had had a previous similar injury 4 years before. And my reading of the case, which obviously will only be snapshots from the medical experts' reports, is they possibly put too much emphasis on saying that he had a dormant condition. They seem to think it was similar to the Fidelity against Mitchell case, but in that case, the person had tuberculosis, which, if they hadn't had their sprain injury, wouldn't have revived at all, but carried on remaining dormant. However, with the Ethan Lowe case, we're talking about the same condition throughout. So we're talking about disc degeneration and disc protrusion all the way through, both in 2016 and 2020. So I think that there was more relevancy in terms of the vulnerability that he had to having more drastic effects to the injury he had in 2020.
Not at all black and white, but how do we square the reference that the list of benefits refer to it needing to be permanent? Does that mean that the need is there to have surgery?
Well, a reasonable approach is taken, but there will potentially be an express definition for permanent in the policy. But the underlying approach with this type of cover is to look at optimum treatment, and if perhaps there is surgery as an option, and it has a reasonably good uh, prognosis and ability to considerably improve the situation, and there is a reasonable body of opinion recommending that treatment, then it is reasonable for the insurer to say that that should be followed through, and then an assessment made afterwards as to whether it has worked or not and improved the situation.
Right. And we don't have an awful lot of time for many more, but there's a question that's come up which has not got an address or a name attached to it. So as we won't be able to email that answer back, I just wondered whether you had a view on whether a gnat bite was an accident.
A gnat bite.
A gnat bite. One presupposes there must have been a
Oh,
very awful response to it or a reaction to it, I suppose. Interesting food for thought, though, would you say?
oh, food. Yeah, definitely food for. I might have to think about that one.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Would you like to finish up yourself? And I'll pass the baton back to you now. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks ever so much for joining us. There will be a recording of this session which can be circulated along with the slides. Before the end of the session, a survey will crop up, and it would be really helpful if you could provide some feedback. But also, we're very interested to hear of any um, ideas of new topics that you would like to hear about. In terms of the next session, this is going to be taking place on the 1st of May, so just after Easter. And this will be on warranties and indemnities, and will be by my colleagues Alistair Dick and Sophie Briggs. So thank you very much for joining us.